Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Doug, for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to be talking about a topic that's much discussed these days, gentrification. I should say that I'm used to sort of presenting to different disciplinary audiences. I'm really happy to have you interrupt me if you have questions. Definitely let me know if something isn't clear. I will also, though, try to leave 15 minutes at the end or something for bigger questions. But I seem to be doing a lot of work these days on gentrification and the consequences of gentrification on such outcomes as racial and economic integration, on displacement, and on also on actually children's health. And I thought about actually trying to tie all of this together into a single talk, which I have to say, for the doctoral students that are here, it's a really bad idea, but I've kind of done it anyway, so against my better judgment. But I'm mostly, you see I bolded this one at the top, I'm mostly going to be talking about this first paper, but I may try to squeeze in, I hope, some findings from the later papers, just because frankly I'd love to get some feedback on them. So. There's growing concern, as all of you know, about gentrification around the country. There's now people talk about hyper gentrification, and there's heightened concern and anxiety in communities of color. And I think that this quote from the Los Angeles Times, I think, summarizes it nicely. This is Black people in particular will feel the sting. That's the sting of gentrification. We will be out not just apartments and homes we can afford to rent or pay the mortgage on. We will lose our space, our place. And there's even concern about gentrification in Detroit these days. But I don't want in any way, I just want to be clear up front that I don't want in any way to minimize the anxiety that families are facing, that people are shouldering crushing housing cost burdens around the United States right now and are deeply worried about losing their homes and their communities. But I do think that the conventional narrative about gentrification misses some potential opportunities that from the increased investment that gentrification brings. And one of those opportunities is the increase in economic and racial integration that comes from the entry of higher income and sometimes white households into lower income and sometimes predominantly minority communities. And that's something that I'm sort of going to focus on today. I think that not many people have looked at gentrification through the lens of integration. Although, Doug, I have to say you wrote about this a while ago, a little bit about this. But and I want to be clear that that this is not the way that integration generally has happened historically in the United States. And this chart basically shows, this bar graph shows you the share of neighborhoods that became integrated during a decade. What share started out as predominantly white? So in other words, what share were integrated through families of color moving into predominantly white communities versus what share were integrated through white households moving into predominantly minority communities. And you can see overwhelmingly, neighborhoods in the United States have been integrated through families of color moving into largely white communities. So the burden of integration, traditionally in the United States, has fallen on the shoulders of families of color. There's been a little bit of an uptick during the 2000s, where you saw more white households moving into in predominantly minority communities and integrating those communities, and I think that was sort of driven by integration, and that's those are sort of a little sliver is what mostly I'm going to focus on. There are not many people have looked at this, I said, at gentrification through the lens of integration, and so there are lots of unanswered questions. What extent does gentrification actually foster economic and racial integration in the short run? Does that persist over time? What explains the variation in stability? So why is it that some neighborhoods that that integrate through gentrification are able to remain integrated over time, and why do some sort of tip? And how does the integration that results from gentrification differ from that results from families of color moving into predominantly white communities? And ultimately, what I'm really interested in is how does gentrification affect the well-being of low-income children that are sort of born into communities that gentrify? And I hope to be able to touch on that a little bit today. Just to get some sort of definitions, gentrification is a term that means something different to everybody. And so let me just start with a definition. The way that I'm going to define gentrification here is basically defining, using census tracts to proxy for neighborhoods, defining the sort of low income or gentrifiable neighborhoods are those that are in the bottom 40% of neighborhoods within a metropolitan area at the start of a decade, and that those that gentrify are those that experience an increase in the ratio of their median income to the median income of the metropolitan area of more than 0.1. Okay, that's sort of a significant, large increase. And if you look using that measure of gentrification, you can see that the observers are correct in sensing that gentrification, the prevalence of gentrification is increasing over time. Although, again, using different measures of gentrification, whether you look at gains in the percent college educated or gains in increases in rents, you see sort of the same increasing trend. It's also, racial integration is also a term that means different things to different people, and any definition is sort of going to be inherently arbitrary, but I've chosen a very simple and pretty expansive definition of integration, which is neighborhoods that are between 25 and 75% non-Hispanic white. And predominantly minority tracts are those that are between 0 and 25% non-Hispanic white. Those neighborhoods in turn can be majority black, majority Hispanic, or mixed minority. I'm mostly going to group all the predominantly minority neighborhoods together for the purposes of today, but the differences, there actually aren't that sharp differences. Certainly not, really the patterns in the majority black and majority Hispanic neighborhoods are pretty identical. So, and this definition again is arbitrary. When we sort of use sensitivity bounds to look at different definitions, we find results qualitatively the same. So the first question that we want to look at is whether, during the decade of gentrification, do we see much change in the racial composition of neighborhoods that gentrify? And I'm going to focus on neighborhoods. There's central city low-income neighborhoods. Actually, only in our definition, only central city low-income neighborhoods can gentrify. Among those, we're going to look at the predominantly minority neighborhoods, and then focusing in on the predominantly minority neighborhoods that gentrify. This is the predominantly minority neighborhoods made up about 15% of the neighborhoods that gentrified during the 1980s, but that rose to about 35% during the 2000s. So over time, it appears that white households are more open to sort of white gentrifiers, or gentrifiers in general, I should say, are more open to moving into predominantly minority areas. And this simple regression basically shows that low-income tracts with larger black and Hispanic shares during the 1980s, the first column, were less likely to gentrify. Okay, it's a very simple model of, there's some other controls here, but of the probability of gentrification, and you can see that the tracts with larger black and Hispanic populations were less likely to gentrify during the 1980s, but we saw a real shift during the 2000s. Those neighborhoods were actually, the percent black had no association with the probability of gentrification during the 2000s, and neighborhoods with larger Latino populations were actually more likely to gentrify during the 2000s. But my real interest is understanding what happens to those neighborhoods when they gentrify, and whether or not we see them becoming more racially integrated. And what this chart shows is just the contemporaneous change in percent non-Hispanic white in predominantly minority neighborhoods that gentrified during the 1980s in the first column, during the 1990s in the second column, and then between 2000 and 2016. And just focusing on this median right now, you can see that during the 80s and 90s, really, there was virtually no change in the percent non-Hispanic white in these predominantly minority neighborhoods that gentrified. So during the process of gentrification, these neighborhoods did not become more white. The median did not become more white, okay, typically. During the 2000s, we see the median neighborhood did experience a more significant bump up in the share non-Hispanic white of about 7 percentage points. But the median conceals a lot of variation, okay? And these just show sort of the different percentile breaks, and it shows that, 10% of these predominantly minority neighborhoods that gentrified during the 1980s experienced a gain in the percent non-Hispanic white of over 18 percentage points. During the 2000s, 10% actually experienced a gain in non-Hispanic white of about, of more than 29 or 28 or 29 percentage points. So you do see, so that where the sort of the typical neighborhood is not experiencing a lot of racial change during the decade of gentrification, you do see some significant outliers, and I think these outliers are sort of driving the narrative about the conventional narrative about gentrification. So another way to look at this is to look at to what extent, what share of neighborhoods actually transitioned to a different racial category during the decade of gentrification. Okay, and remember, I'm just very simply right now dividing tracks into predominantly minority, racially integrated, and predominantly white. And basically during the decade of gentrification, those tracks that start out as predominantly minority overwhelmingly end up at the end of, they remain predominantly minority at the end of the decade of gentrification. But none become predominantly white. A significant minority, about 21% during the 1980s, become racially integrated during the decade of gentrification. Okay, but of course these neighborhoods could be experiencing, this is just during the decade of gentrification, right? Over the longer run, these neighborhoods could be sort of showing signs of resegregation. And this is something that actually, as far as I can tell, I think no one has really looked at this, sort of looked out over time, and that was really our motivation to say, okay, let's look at the longer term experience of what happened to tracts that gentrified during the 1980s. Let's look at what they look like in 2016. Let's see what kind of changes they experienced, not only during the 80s, but in the 90s and then post-2000. And what is the longer term experience of the tracts that gentrified during the 90s, by 2016. And so for the tracts that gentrified during the 80s, we basically can look at what they look like 36 years later. For the tracts that gentrified during the 1990s, we can basically now look at what they look like, what those neighborhoods look like 26 years later. So we can really get a longer time frame look at what's happening to those neighborhoods. Are they tipping? Are they resegregating? Or are they sort of looking more the same? And so what this shows you, this first bar shows you, is for the predominantly minority census tracts that gentrified during the 1980s, what was their racial composition in 2016? So again, 36 years later. And what do we see? And for the 1990s, what was the racial composition of, again, those tracts that started out as predominantly minority low-income neighborhoods and gentrified during the 90s? What did they look like in 2016? And you can see, once again, most of these neighborhoods remained predominantly minority in 2016, A small share of the neighborhoods that gentrified in the 80s actually had resegregated to become predominantly white. It's about 5% of those in the 1980s. But a significant minority became racially integrated, right? Were racially integrated in 2016. Again, 31% of those that gentrified during the 1980s by 2016 were racially integrated, right? And so the question, of course, is whether those neighborhoods, although they look racially integrated in 2016, were they continuing to gain white population or lose minority population over time? So were they really on the path to becoming predominantly white and resegregating, but we just hadn't sort of observed that yet. And so we're in the process of sort of running models and regressions on this, but I just want to show some very simple figures here to show that, and what this chart does, well, I hope this is simple, but basically this shows you, it takes all of the set of predominantly minority neighborhoods that gentrified during the 1980s and became racially integrated through the inflow of white households during the 1980s, and then looks at, we divide those into 4 buckets depending on their, whether they experienced a large gain in percent white during the 1990s, and then the large gain in percent white or a sort of no change or a loss in percent during the 2000 to 2016 period. And so what this shows, for instance, is that 18% of the neighborhoods that integrated through the predominantly minority neighborhoods that became racially integrated through gentrification during the 80s continued to see significant gains in the white population over the next 2 decades, okay? And so those are sort of the neighborhoods that seem, although they're still, most of those are still, they still appear to be racially integrated. They do also appear, this suggests they're sort of on a path, perhaps, to resegregating. Now, is 18% a large number or a small number, right? What should our benchmark be on that? And I'm not sure what, we can talk about that. I'm not sure what the answer is there. But I will say that we did look at we compared this sort of racial stability to the racial stability of neighborhoods that integrate in sort of the more traditional American way, which is through households of color moving into predominantly white communities. And we found that those neighborhoods are significantly less racially stable. So if you look at these neighborhoods, these are predominantly white neighborhoods that integrate through the inflow of minority households, of households of color. And then we look at during the 1980s, and we look at how many of those continued to experience large losses in their white population share during the 1990s and then post-2000. And you see that a majority of those neighborhoods actually, had experienced large white population losses during the next 2 decades, which, and perhaps this isn't surprising, right, given what we know about white racial attitudes and also, frankly, just about the broader demographic changes in the population. But I think it's striking. So I think the point here, let me go back to this one, is this is sort of not to say that, on the one hand, I think there's more, I think more of these neighborhoods, more of these predominantly minority neighborhoods that are gentrifying are ending up integrated, and they're remaining more stably integrated, I think, on average, the typical neighborhood than I think many people think. But I also really want to underscore that there's a lot of variation, right? And I just want to highlight some of that variation through, I just picked out two census tracts in my hometown of New York to show you the kind of variation. And there's one in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. This one is right underneath the the Williamsburg Bridge, and this is just sort of the poster child of, or ground zero of gentrification, I think. And if you just look at the change in non-Hispanic white, so these are actually census tracts that gentrified during the 1990s, and you can see that the population in Williamsburg went from 14% non-Hispanic white to 38% non-Hispanic white during the decade of gentrification, right? But then after that initial decade of gentrification, this neighborhood continued to lose. You look at the change in percent Hispanic, right? It lost a really very large share of its Latino population. The percent non-Hispanic white continued to grow. This is a neighborhood that it sort of really clearly appears on the way to becoming, right, predominantly non-Hispanic white. There's in another neighborhood, another census tract in West Midtown of Manhattan. This one is between like 57th Street. It's just above 57th Street on the far west side of Manhattan. And this one, you can see what happened during the 1990s when it gentrified. The percent non-Hispanic white went from 17 to 38%. But then over the next 16 years after that, actually the percent non-Hispanic white actually fell, right? And so this is, it's a different experience in terms of and the income ratio also sort of stabilized here. If you look at the top row, where in Williamsburg, you can see that the income ratio, again, that's the ratio of the median income of that census tract to the median income of the metro area, continued to increase. So this is a neighborhood that's sort of the...
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, please.
A large Asian share in the
Yeah.
West. And I'm wondering to what extent that's developing an Asian, because there could be a lot of immigrants that are driving that.
Yeah.
So foreign-born are coming in with big bucks and, pulling this. So because the Hispanic share held kind of steady.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it didn't in Williamsburg, right? It's like in Williamsburg. No, you're right. I need to, I thought maybe I shouldn't even put this up precisely because of that question, because I don't know exactly what's happening here. I don't know who this population is.
But I think it's an important.
It is, no, it's a really interesting question.
What's the dynamic in there?
It's a really interesting question. And so I think but it does, my point here is sort of to suggest that, to illustrate the variation and to say, okay, what's the difference between these two census tracts? Both are in kind of, this one's in Manhattan, in Midtown Manhattan. I mean, this is sort of a neighborhood that you would expect to sort of really the gentrification to spiral. But I think that the clear difference is public housing. So this census tract in West Midtown includes it's sort of part of it is in a large public housing development, and this is not that unusual or unique. It turns out that if you look at sort of the Pumas, I probably don't have to define that term in this crowd, but which is sort of groups of about 120,000 people in New York. Roughly 12% of the housing units in Pumas that sort of are gentrifying in New York City are public housing. And another about 25% of the housing units in those neighborhoods are other forms of subsidized housing, privately owned subsidized housing. So I think that this is an important source of, I think, I don't think we think about place-based housing. We often think of place-based housing as concentrating poverty, but in the context of gentrification, place-based housing may be locking in the little bit of economic diversity that we have left in cities like Manhattan and San Francisco.
I'm wondering, maybe getting to this, if you look at people with and without school-age kids, in all of these cases, just kind of off the top of my head, it seems like the distribution into a place like Williamsburg is very young and childless, at least initially.
Yep, it is.
Maybe part of the driver in that neighborhood is that they're also in District 3 where they don't have selective schools.
Yeah. So it's a great question, and I'll use that to sort of answer another question, which is, it's I guess, you might ask, and maybe all of you were thinking this, like, what's she talking about? Is this really integration when you have families living in public housing aside from, it may be rich, childless, white, households of young 20-somethings across the street who are working on Wall Street. And, and I think, and if you look at we have looked at the demographic differences, so to try to say, like, to what extent do we see sort of demographic matches or mismatches? And we do see that, and it's, not surprisingly, that the white households in these gentrifying neighborhoods are far less likely to have children. I think that doesn't mean that integration doesn't matter, to the extent you think that integration is about ensuring that all households, and I think we should be particularly concerned about children having access to the same set of resources as others, then I think, it is significant. It may be relevant, right? Whether, but I actually, your particular question, I think, is about the differences between the sort of gentrifiers moving into West Midtown versus Williamsburg, and I can't answer that. I haven't looked at that. We just sort of looked on average.
It's not a specific question about those two, but rather, like, is it the case that you have more opportunity for takeoff when you have a much younger age set than when you have an age distribution, that there's some limited supply of given other factors that are in this system?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and one of the things that we're doing, that continuing this work, is really trying to model and understand why it is that some gentrifying neighborhoods are sort of remaining integrated over time, and why some aren't. And I think those demographic difference maybe is part of it. So it's a great question. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could define Puma.
Oh, sorry. A Puma, it's the public use microdata area. So, sorry. That's what. So they're, aggregates of census tracts, and so where you can get microdata from the census and you can identify them. That's why they're useful. So you can sort of observe mobility patterns at an individual level into and out of Pumas, right? Okay. So I want to talk a little bit. Now I'm going to squeeze in a little bit of these few other papers, right? One is just whether gentrification, I think I made just one slide from this, but at the same time, in parallel, we're actually trying to model the economic integration and the stability of the income mixing that occurs that kind of occurs mechanically through gentrification. You're going to see some income mixing, but the real question is whether those neighborhoods tip over time to becoming predominantly high income, or whether actually there is some income mixing over time. And what this shows is the ratio. These are all regression adjusted. So, but it basically shows the average income ratio. Again, the ratio of the income of the median income of a census tract to the median income of the metropolitan area in successive decades for tracts. These are all central city tracts in the United States that were low income in 1980. Okay, that means they were in the bottom 40% of their metropolitan area. The blue line shows the income trajectory of the neighborhoods that gentrified during the 1980s. Okay, and the black line shows those that didn't gentrify. And, not surprisingly, you see there's a big bump up in the income ratio during the decade of gentrification, as you would expect, right? With the typical gentrifying neighborhood had a ratio of, 0.358. That means the median income in that census tract was 36% of the median income in the metropolitan area. By the end of the decade, it was basically, on average, these neighborhoods had incomes equivalent to their metropolitan area at the end. So this is a big jump up, but then importantly, after that initial jump, actually you see pretty much stability. Again, this is on average, right? On average, on average, these neighborhoods really saw no income change after that initial jump up in income, okay? Suggesting there's some some potential for integration in these neighborhoods. There's a lot of variation, and of those low-income tracts that gentrified during the 1980s, 12.6% actually saw sort of evidence of kind of tipping or snowballing, and saw successive these significant large gains in their income ratio during the 1990s and then post 2000. So that's something that we're now kind of modeling this and trying to really test again sort of how much income tipping is occurring and where is it occurring and where is it not occurring. So I think all of this again, I think that sort of the takeaways from these papers on integration are that I think there's I think more stability in the integration that is created through gentrification than I think many people think, but there's a lot of variation. Okay, there's a lot of variation, and I think that the conventional narrative is kind of driven by the outliers, but those neighborhoods do exist, and I think we need to understand more about that variation. And I think one source, and I think that we can't just assume that gentrification is going to lead to stable economic or racial integration. I think that that policies like place-based subsidized housing are important to lock in the diversity. The reason that I'm really interested in this question is ultimately because I really am, I care about the children. I want to know sort of what's happening to the children, the well-being of the children who are living or sort of born into gentrifying neighborhoods. I think we have, rigorous evidence now that children who low-income children that move to higher income areas benefit from those moves. And so I think it's a reasonable question to ask, okay, well, do the low-income children who are sort of who stay in neighborhoods that change and experience income gains, do they benefit similarly from those increases if they're able to remain in place, say, with housing subsidies? Yeah.
With respect to the neighborhood return
Yeah.
and they're stable, does it have to do with the stability, the composition of the housing stock, rental versus owner? Because I think they have very different dynamics, and that affects also whether poor children are going to go to one school or 15 schools in the course of their educational trajectory, which is important in this gentrification shuffle that's taking place. So do you model, did you take into account?
Yeah, well, we're still, like I said, we're still in the process of doing that, but the short answer is yes, it does matter. And, and rental neighborhoods generally are, they change more rapidly, but, so more to come on that, but it absolutely matters.
And that's in addition to the tall buildings,
Yes.
the public housing.
Exactly.
The dynamics are
Yep.
the same.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. Absolutely. So what, the question is whether, could there potentially be, it's sort of on net, I mean, I think that gentrification may bring some benefits, it also may bring some costs for children, and sort of, so on net, how do we think about this? The first question to ask is sort of the question that frankly 98% of the research on gentrification focuses on, which is whether or not gentrification displaces the poor. Much of that research, as much as I feel like that research is asking the wrong question, I am now contributing to it as well, but most of that research, though I will say, is focused on the 1980s and 90s at a time and didn't find much displacement at all, but that was a time when gentrification, it was a very different phenomenon. So you had higher income households moving into neighborhoods that had been dramatically depopulated during the 1970s, right? And so there actually was lots of room for more people to move into those neighborhoods without displacement. Now that sort of the market is tightening in cities, I think there's much more reason that we'd expect to see displacement today. And I think, I mean, another problem with a lot of the, and I'm saying, and I've written this, so I'm criticizing myself as well. I mean, the research that I've done and others have done displacement is that it wasn't, the researchers didn't have access to longitudinal data that could track households over time, okay? There's some exceptions to that. Jackie Huang, who spent 2 years here, is using, really clever use of consumer credit panel data. One of my students has, a terrific paper using linked census data. But what we are, I'm focusing on, I'm working with some colleagues at NYU, actually using Medicaid claims data. So I think that there's actually potential use of administrative data to track mobility patterns. And I'm also especially, and sort of what's the advantage here? First of all, it tracks, it basically covers really a near universe of poor and near poor children. I'm looking at New York City right now. We have the data for all of New York State. I'm also particularly interested, the research on displacement has not focused particularly on children and young children. And I think the extent that I think we should care more about what happens to young children. We know that it does seem like we have evidence that those young children are more affected by their environment. And so it offers a near universe. It's longitudinal data. You can observe the addresses. Right now we have a 7-year panel built. Actually, it's a little bit more, but we're building it out. So over time, we should be able to get, many years of follow people for many years. And I should say another reason that I'm focusing on young children also, I care about them, but it also is, it turns out, they're much less likely to cycle off of Medicaid. So they stay on Medicaid. We have their precise addresses, so we can link to detailed information about their micro neighborhood environment, also about their buildings. We have data also on health outcomes. So the extent that you want to look at sort of ultimate impacts on well-being, somewhere down the line, I'd love to look at, longer term outcomes on education and employment and earnings, but right now we have data on health. And so what do? We basically look at children born between 2006 and 2008, and who, when we look at those who live we restrict to those who live in multifamily buildings because we want to make sure we're getting renters and not higher and poorer households, not there's some households, children on Medicaid who are on Medicaid for disability, but who live in, but who are higher income. So and we focus on those who are continuously enrolled in Medicaid between 2009 and 2015. We also we've loosened that a little bit. We've looked at some robustness tests, but you can see here, again, dividing neighborhoods just into these sort of simple buckets of those that gentrified during 2000, that were low income in 2009 and then gentrified between 2009 and 2015. Those that are persistently, those that were low income in 2009 and were, remained low income in 2015, and those that were higher income in 2009, and so really those were not even eligible for neighborhoods that were eligible for gentrification. And so really what we're interested is in comparing, with regression controls, but comparing the experience of children who were sort of born into neighborhoods that would then gentrify versus children who were born into these low-income neighborhoods that remained persistently low income. And there's, obviously, I'm not going to claim that this is fully exogenous where families end up, but we do, we do try to, as best we can, sort of control for individual characteristics and control for neighborhoods that are at least observationally equivalent as of 2009, and then see what happens. And what do we see consistent with other other research during this earlier time period? We see no difference in the mobility, the likelihood that the share of kids who move during this time period, regardless of whether they're sort of born into a gentrifying neighborhood, which is the royal blue, and then the lighter blue, those that are born into a persistently low-income neighborhood. And if you just focus on the two bars to the right, those are, one of the advantages of these data is that we can separate, which most research on gentrification hasn't been able to do, separate people who live in subsidized housing and have an ability to stay in their units versus those that are in market rate rental housing who you think would be most vulnerable. And even those you can see even the children in market rate housing are no more likely to move when they're living in gentrifying neighborhoods. I do want to point out, though, there is this big difference between the mobility rates of those living in subsidized housing and those living in market rate housing. So on the one hand, while gentrification, sort of living in a gentrifying neighborhood, doesn't seem to elevate mobility rates for children in either market rate housing or subsidized housing, it's clear that regardless of what neighborhood you live in, children are more able to stay in those neighborhoods, or they do stay in those neighborhoods more when they live in subsidized housing. And so I think that sort of points to, again, the power of the subsidized housing at allowing people to stay in their neighborhoods as their neighborhoods change. I do want to sort of underscore that I think the takeaway from this should not be that there's no displacement, okay? The takeaway should be that there is, that low-income children are residentially unstable regardless of the neighborhood where they live in. And there just isn't much difference. And if you look at those shares, I mean, this is over a 7-year period, and you're seeing almost half of children are moving to a new neighborhood during this period. And so, again, it's not that there's no displacement, there's displacement everywhere. So, Kathy?
Yeah, I would expect really different stories for people in hard unit public housing and people with vouchers, because...
Yeah, we don't have the vouchers yet. This is all hard units. It's just, it's public housing, and it is Section 8, place-based.
Site-based.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think really interesting question about vouchers.
One risk with site-based is that it will flip to market rate, but you don't seem to be seeing that.
No, there hasn't been a lot of that here during this time period. I think the city has been very aggressive in basically renegotiating with the owners of subsidized housing. So, yeah, but yeah.
I'm curious, when persistently low-income communities gentrify, can that affect the supply of subsidized housing?
Yes, it can. I mean, that's to sort of Kathy's point. You mean in terms of sort of the new, it's going to be, first of all, more expensive to build subsidized housing in those neighborhoods, right? Because then the land costs go up. And so if the city wants to sort of write down the rents, the difference between market rents and the subsidized rents it's going to be higher. And the private owners of subsidized buildings are going to have more of an incentive to opt out, okay? So public housing, no. Public housing, because public housing is sort of permanently affordable, but again, so from a policy perspective, I think, it might be city officials should prioritize preservation of subsidized housing in areas that are gentrifying, and hopefully get in early when it's not as expensive. So, okay, let me quickly.
Will we be able to get the Section 8 data for New York?
Yes, we just haven't put it in yet. Yeah, I mean, yes, we have it, and we have the Medicaid data. The problem is sort of getting the groups, merging them and getting, it's not actually, it wouldn't be challenging technically to do it, it's getting the permissions to merge them. So that's the issue, right? It's, okay.
Yes, I know about that.
Okay, can I just quickly finish, because I'm almost done. Okay, I'm sorry, so really quickly, the other message I should say about this is that, most of the literature on displacement has simply looked at mobility rates, but that doesn't really answer the question, right? Because it could be that I'm showing, hey, the exit rates are the same, but maybe in gentrifying neighborhoods, you see fewer upwardly mobile moves and more downwardly mobile moves, and it just nets out so that the mobility is the same. So we looked at that also. We looked at sort of the changes in the neighborhood environments experienced by kids who are sort of born into gentrifying neighborhoods and those that are born into the persistently poor. And what this shows you is basically sort of the difference in difference. So this shows that for kids who were born into gentrifying neighborhoods, over this sort of 7-year period, they experienced a 5 percentage point greater reduction, or to 4.5 percentage greater reduction in poverty, neighborhood poverty, than the kids sort of born into persistently low-income neighborhoods. Okay, so they're experiencing, and they're similarly experiencing a greater reduction in neighborhood crime. So they're moving. Now, some of this might just be driven by the fact, and much of it is driven by the stayers, the kids who stay in the neighborhoods that get safer and see increases in income. But even when you look at movers only, you see even the movers, the kids who are moving from gentrifying neighborhoods, are actually ending up in slightly lower poverty neighborhoods as compared to the kids who are moving from persistently low-income neighborhoods. Okay, now I don't want to exaggerate this. This is still a small difference, but the point is we don't see this evidence of the children from gentrifying neighborhoods experiencing more downwardly mobile moves. It's actually, if anything, the opposite. Just very quickly, we're also looking at health outcomes and just, little teaser, what are we seeing? We're seeing that the kids that were sort of born into gentrifying neighborhoods, on the one hand, they were seeing a reduction in obesity diagnoses, they're seeing fewer visits for asthma, but at the same time, they're seeing there's an increase in prevalence of anxiety diagnoses for those children. So I think that sort of the jury is very much still out on what the net effect is, and I think that we need to there's probably a longer time frame to really observe any significant impacts on health. So I will.
Ingrid, another question with
Yeah.
your asthma, because that suggests the housing stock might have been different in the gentrifying neighborhoods to begin with.
Well,
Because
right.
asthma is so linked to
Yeah.
the housing.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the change over time. So it's actually a change. And so I think that it might have been different from the start, but it also suggests it might have improved more.
But why?
That's what.
Do you think the housing stock got better?
Yes, I think. I think on net, whether these kids, the poor and near poor kids are living in better housing stock, but there's more investment in the housing stock in those neighborhoods. So it is possible. Yeah. Yeah, I'm saying it's a short period. I'm not going to, the truth is, the ultimate, I realize this slide is a little misleading. Really, we're not seeing, I would actually say that we're not seeing much in the way of changes in health. It's also a short period to see changes in kids' health. And over a 7-year period, kids are pretty healthy. And so, I think that really what you'd want to look is sort of 15 years from now, what are the 20 years from now, sort of are there any differences in health? But we do, I think these are, what I'd say is these are sort of, they're suggestive of what some of the longer term changes might be. So, I'm sorry. So, you had a question back there?
I was interested in the previous graph about how homelessness came into the picture. So when kids move into the shelter system, are they kind of coded as being in that neighborhood? And is that something that you guys can look at moving forward? Is it like 1 in 10 kids by 8th grade or something?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, they're coded as being in the neighborhoods where the shelters are located. And yes, we can pull them out, but we have not done that yet. It's a great point.
Question from a graduate student. Go ahead.
Yeah.
You mentioned as one of the takeaways that the narratives about gentrification are often driven by outliers. And I was just sort of wondering about if we go back to the slide of the racial change in the racial categories, was it 75% remaining predominantly minority? And so I was just wondering what's going on in those neighborhoods. And then secondarily, I think the 2 examples we looked at, the increase in the relative income share went from sort of 40% maybe to 120 or 130. And given that the cutoff, I think you said was 0.1, I was wondering whether those are sort of anomalous in terms of such a drastic increase in economic change.
Yeah. There are, okay, so let me start with this one. So you're saying what's happening in this sort of the royal blue area. So I think there are a couple things that's happening. One is that there are a lot of predominantly minority neighborhoods that gentrify without experiencing racial change. You have middle-class minorities moving into neighborhoods. Some of this could be picking up sort of incumbent upgrading, improvement in the, among income gains among the residents who are living there. And then some of this is about, you sort of see some change in the initial decade, and then you see a stabilization. So I think it's a combination of both those factors. So this one on the income gains, or this one,
Yeah.
you wanted to look at. So, yeah, look, this is, I mean, Williamsburg, is this, I think that there are few places where you've seen gentrification as dramatic and as rapid as you've seen in Williamsburg. So I think this absolutely is an outlier, absolutely. But that's sort of my point. It's not, that's sort of what we, there are neighborhoods. It's not only Williamsburg, and it's not only in New York City. When you look at sort of where these outlier neighborhoods are, there's some, in cities and in places you'd be surprised, but where you've seen this dramatic change. But it's a good question. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about tweaking the question that you're asking a little bit.
Mhm.
Because gentrification is going to keep pushing and pushing, and I think the question is really, what can cities do to manage it?
Yeah,
So it's really
totally agree.
under what circumstances
I totally agree.
does gentrification have the least bad impacts on the community?
Yeah.
Looking at civic engagement.
Yeah.
It just seems that maybe a more complicated question would produce a more useful answer. Not
Yeah.
that this is not a complicated question.
Yeah, no, and it's really, that is sort of the question in the paper. I'm just, I don't know, I hang around too many economists that you have, supposed to have these whatever really inflammatory paper titles. But, so I mean, that is absolutely my interest, is sort of under what circumstances can gentrification be inclusive, right? And actually I have another paper on that, that's all about sort of what are the policy levers that we have. And I think we have, I think a lot of it is place-based subsidized housing. I mean, it's not, to Kathy's point, it's not clear to me that vouchers are going to help in these. And Kathy, you've got more insight on this than I do, but anecdotally, we're seeing in somewhat in the data we're beginning to look at, we're seeing that, voucher use declines in gentrifying areas because landlords all of a sudden have they have, a lot more demand from market rate tenants. So I think there's there are protections that you can put in place for sure. I mean, I think there's a set of policy recommendations and policy tools to help stabilize the families that are in place, which I think are really important. But I feel like 90% of the policy focus is on is on protecting the tenants who are in place. And I think that you can, if you care about creating integrated and diverse environments, then you're going to sort of win the battle but lose the war. And I think that that sort of for locking in and preserving that diversity over time, I think we need place-based subsidized housing or community land trusts. I mean, there are different ways of doing it in a different setting. So, but you need some way to sort of keep some of the housing stock permanently affordable. So, Kathy?
Yeah, so I like that answer, very much in line with Laura Tock's work. But you have, and this is just a tiny piece of a vast research career, so I'm going to ask you a question you may know something about, you may not, but Melody Boyd and I did some work in Philadelphia, and earlier you said that African Americans who bear the brunt of integration because they're the ones that are moving in, but you could think of it another way, that white, largely working class communities, right, are the ones that bear the brunt of seeing their community change due to gentrification. And that's been the story in Philadelphia and a lot of other cities. It's really the white working class neighborhoods that have seen change and perhaps are least prepared to deal with it. And what we saw in Philadelphia was a real loss of social cohesion and identity within the neighborhood and increasing social distrust. So now I'm sounding like Bob Putnam. I don't mean to.
Yeah.
But it seems like we need to go beyond housing policy to think about building social trust, social cohesion, social trust. All of these goods we know are vital, maybe in particular for preventing crime, but also for providing positive features of the neighborhood. So Can, first of all, what do we know about these white neighborhoods and how they're doing with this integration? And second, is there something else besides land trust and that kind of thing that could build social bonds?
Yeah. Okay, so good question. So I will say that I am spending more time, thinking about this sort of newer form of integration and what the social cohesion is in the neighborhoods that are integrating through gentrification. And so, and I will say there, as I talked to you a little bit about last night, we did, I normally do quantitative research, but was part of a qualitative study. We're looking at the experience of public housing residents in gentrifying neighborhoods in New York, and we hired community ethnographers, public housing residents, to talk to their neighbors about their experiences, and we found that they appreciated a lot of the changes that they were seeing in the neighborhood. They appreciated that what they felt they felt more safe in their neighborhoods. They appreciated the new amenities in many cases, but they also felt a greater sense of anxiety and alienation, and it's not. And they didn't feel connected to their new neighbors. Now, maybe that's an extreme because you've got public housing, but I will say that to answer your second question, there was sort of a little bit of a glimmer of hope in a few places where you had strong settlement houses, nonprofit settlement houses, who were working in the community, and they were really making strides, I think, in helping to stitch together the community. And so I don't know that this is a role for government to necessarily, I'm not sure, but let me just say, I don't think government is necessarily very good at building social cohesion within a neighborhood, but it seems to me that this is where nonprofits can be terrific. And these are nonprofits. There are a lot of nonprofits who have a long history in a neighborhood. They have trust within a neighborhood, and they have an ability to bring people together and build bridges, and to ensure that within these gentrifying neighborhoods, that everybody in that neighborhood has access to whatever growing opportunities are there. So that's what I would say on that one. So
Maybe ask a broader question. In this research, you focus on census tracts or neighborhoods that are being affected by gentrification. But whites come from somewhere, blacks go somewhere in the process. So what's a larger picture? When gentrification happens, it happens not just to those neighborhoods. Things happen to other neighborhoods as well, not being studied outside those tracts.
Yeah. So that's a great question, and there are, I think that we are seeing, somewhat more growing diversity in suburban areas. That is maybe sort of accompanying gentrification, but that's really sort of a general equilibrium. What's sort of the ultimate effect on the system, and that's not something that I can really answer through the analysis that I've done so far. But it's absolutely the right question. It's sort of on net, and I think you'd want to look at sort of at a city level, right, at a metropolitan area level. So, I'm doing other research trying to look at sort of what is we're looking at shocks to when we see increases in income among the college-educated population, what happens to the well-being of low-income households, what happens to their housing, what happens to their job prospects, what happens to their neighborhoods, and so that gets at this a little bit more, and we're seeing sort of they basically see greater labor market opportunities, but on the housing side, they do seem to be seeing, faced with higher rents, they are economizing on housing and living in somewhat more crowded situations. So that's sort of a project that more closely addresses that question. So.
One final question.
Fascinating presentation. I was kind of wondering, what are the qualities of stably integrated communities? What are some of the things that maybe allow for them to persist in being integrated and not making this kind of switch over?
Yeah. So that's such a good question, and it's one that I wish I had a richer answer today, then I feel like maybe I can come back, and if I can invite myself back in another year or something, or two, I'll have a clearer answer to that, because that's very much sort of at the top of our research agenda. I mean, right now, you know, again, subsidized housing seems to be playing a big part of this, but we're not seeing any clear predictors. It's not about the initial income. It's in the neighborhood. It doesn't seem to be as much about the region as I would have thought. But anyway, so more to come on that one. But that's the right question to ask.
Okay, thank you very much for your.
Oh, great. You need to break. I got my sweater on. So.
Okay.